Welcome. Today we are going to address the term the passions and what do these mean. Most of you are likely not that familiar with this idea as it's something that kind of went out of favor in the mid 20th century. But before that, this term was widely understood and had different connotations and different weights depending on region, locality, are we in India or Europe? But the basic idea is still there. And we're going to kind of tease this out and look at what different philosophers have thought about this idea of the passions. So what are the passions? Basically, the idea of the passions is that they are those natural inclinations which we find in everyone. It's not that you love hiking, that's not your passion, as it were, but it's what's leading you to go that direction. Passions, because they are these inclinations that exist within you, are very powerful, and because of their raw power, they have a tendency to be destructive, even though sometimes they help. They are not in themselves generally seen as inherently good or bad, but we should liken it to what George Washington says of fire and of the government, that it would make a handy servant but a dangerous master. These passions are things that, if used well, can propel you to excel, but if slightly out of hand, can bring about ruin. Some just need to be kept low and in check, while others you have to keep a right balance because too much or too little can become problematic. Some basic examples of this. For instance, a parent's love and desire for their children to excel is generally seen as a good thing, but it could go bad if it's too much. What if it includes murdering that child's rival in a spelling bee or class competition because they want their kid to get all of the attention? We would definitely see this as too much. Although the upper limit of a parent's love for a child is really high, there is an upper limit of what's allowed to be done. Similarly, we might have this inclination towards companionship. We are indeed social creatures, that we need to indeed be with others. And that if this is silenced, we are usually going to be alone and miserable. But if our need for companionship is taken to an extreme, that we're not ever comfortable not being with other people and can't just be by ourselves at all, then that's also not healthy. And we have to find a balancing act between being isolated from the rest of the world and having to have everybody around. Similarly, if you were to force anyone to be around you so you wouldn't be left alone, you're taking your natural inclination for companionship and twisting it in a way that isn't healthy for either you or those people that you're coercing to be with you. Some of you want to look good. This is a good idea, right? You want to be presentable. People who don't care at all what they look like are slobs and they've lost notions of self-respect. But if all you care about is what you look like, then you are vain and might even go so far as excessive plastic surgeries that make you look scary more than anything else. You can look up a million examples of that on your own. With this said, most of our ethical and religious traditions speak of the passions not in the vein of them being beneficial to us, that we could foster something and have something good. Usually this would be identified as virtues that should be pushed and you should use your passions for that. But usually when the term passions is used in of itself, we're looking more at the negative effect. We're looking at what happens when it's not kept in the proper check. It really wasn't until the mid 20th century that the term passionate at all was seen as a positive. Now, we want to see that you're passionate about something, and this is, common discussions. But before the mid 20th century, if something was passion, it was dangerous, it was bad, it was generally viewed as something negative. As such, from a philosophical stance, when we speak of the passions, we're not talking about your love for the outdoors or something else that you put on a dating profile, but the bad or evil things that draw you into areas that aren't beneficial. The passions are natural, but need to be kept in check. This is the idea of mastering it or overcoming the passions instead of simply indulging them. Usually they are identified as such because our natural inclinations have been corrupted in some way by different philosophical and religious systems. Notions of original sin or the fall or samsaric cycle or society, if you'd like to go more Rousseauian, the devil, different extremes, a dualistic universe, something along these lines have corrupted our nature so that our natural inclinations, when allowed to go too far, bring us ruin instead of joy. Some of you might be familiar with the idea of the Catholic notion of the 7 deadly sins. Each of these are attached to the idea of the passions. Buddhism has a similar idea with the 3 poisons: desire, hatred, and ignorance. The goal for most of the religious and ethical systems throughout history has been in trying to help you overcome the passions, to find the balance, to help you have enough strength to say no to these inclinations that take you too far and bring you to ruin. How do you overcome the trials in your life which often lead to these passions and control you instead of you controlling them? Different ethical systems address these specifically, and that's the aim of this class when we're looking at Stoicism, Epicureanism, looking at even Aristotle and Confucius, let alone the religious systems, all kind of give you aids in trying to overcome the passions in your life. By the way, religions are usually more about orthoprax ideas than orthodox ideas. Praxis, action. It's about the right actions. It's about making sure not just that you have the right doxa, teachings, but praxis, actions, that you're doing the right things. Saint Anatole of Optima said that you cannot destroy the passions on your own, but to ask God and he will destroy them if it is indeed profitable for you. And usually there are notions of asceticism attached with overcoming these passions. Asceticism, broadly speaking, is a practice of self-denial that is often the primary tool used in overcoming this. Not indulging in little things, therefore you're able to overcome bigger things. Now, different systems are going to ask you to give up different things. Usually it's not just food, although that's part of it. We see different Hindu ascetics that try to be uncomfortable, try to take away the comfort and ease in their life. Saint Simeon and other stylites lived on top of a pillar, where others simply retreated and fasted or were tempted out in the wilderness. But usually these are a little bit more extreme than what we are going to do. We're trying to find an easier way of overcoming the passions instead of living on a pillar or intentionally making yourself overly uncomfortable or being like Siddhartha Gautama, who fasted to the point that he ate only 1 grain of rice a day. Like, these are a bit more extreme than what we are going to try to do in this class. So the question you should be asking is, what's required of me? What should count as the passions in your own life, and how is it that you should address them? What steps should you take in overcoming these negative inclinations or these bad actions that you have a tendency to fall into, which will differ from person to person? What actions or inclinations are really bad? Which ones count? And which ones are not as bad for you, because you're all different. This requires you to do a little bit of introspection, and if you don't know what introspection is, you should take a long look at yourself. So what inclinations do you have that are good, that help lead you to good things? And some are bad. Which ones are those? How are they similar? How are they different? You should focus in on your own life and figure these out. Now, some specific definitions given us by philosophers on how they saw the passions. And it's important to kind of learn from the breadth of knowledge that exists out there. Cicero quoted Zeno, Stoic, who gives the definition of passion as such, that passion is the commotion of the soul opposed to reason and against nature. Right? What commotion do you have in your own soul that is against your own reason or nature? Descartes said you can usually appoint passions to all the thoughts that are excited in the soul without the help of the will. Right? What things do you not consent to think about that are causing you commotion? We can see a certain overlap between Zeno and Descartes here. And therefore, Descartes continues, no action that comes from them by their impressions are at all in the brain, because anything that is not action is therefore passion. Other early modern philosophers had their own take on it. Spinoza says, disorders of the body, through which the power to act in this body is increased or diminished, helped or reduced. And at that same time, the ideas of these disorders, when we can be the adequate cause of someone, one of these conditions, so by love, action, and in other cases, passion. Right? What's motivating you? And we see here that instead of love, it's passion, which brings you to the opposite side of that. Hume says the passion is a violent emotion of the mind and sensitive to the appearance of good or bad, or object, which, owing to the original constitution of our faculties, is fit, excite, and appetite. This is what's going to happen. It excites you when it's a violent emotion. It's, again, we're seeing these things that are not reasonable. These are impulses which take over and push and cause action one way or the other. Kant speaks of this in a few different ways. He says it's the inclination that the reason, the subject, cannot be controlled or managed with difficulty. There is indeed passion. And that the passion takes the time, and however powerful it may be, she thought, to reach its goal. Passion is like a poison swallowed or disability contracted, and she needs a doctor who heals the soul from inside or outside. Who knows yet, most often, prescribe drugs, palliative. So what is it? It's a poison. It's something that can't be controlled or managed, but you need to find different ways of trying to control and manage them, according to Kant. We do have some positive views of this. Kierkegaard will end up saying that we have lost more when we have lost her passion, when one has lost his passion, in the Diary of the Seducer. Here we're seeing passion connected a lot more with the notion of romantic love, but we're seeing this passion which can, if lost entirely, find yourself devoid of connections with other people. And so while it might be something that is hard to manage, we don't necessarily want to reduce all of the passion, according to Kierkegaard and others. Hegel will even say that nothing great has been done in the world without passion. Right? That this inclination is so powerful that if you want to accomplish something great, you need it. But again, devoid of reason, it can bring you down and bring you to ruin. We can see a modern take of our discussion of the passions with a scene from the more recent Bad Boys movie, Bad Boys for Life, where the captain is telling Will Smith a story about a horse dragging him away, and I have the link to this included in the class. I advise you to look it up, because it helps you understand, maybe in a different way, this idea of something controlling you, that's taking you maybe where you want it to go and maybe where you don't, that you need to ask the horse where it's going instead of you figuring out where you're wanting to go. Going forward, we're going to take a deeper look at how three philosophers treated the notion of the passions specifically. We're going to look at Plato through his dialogue of Phaedrus, a dialogue between Socrates and a character of Phaedrus. We're going to look at Descartes and his work, The Passions of the Soul, and we're going to look at Hume and his dissertation on the passions. In the work of Phaedrus, we have a further discussion about what is the nature of reality and how this works with your thoughts and recollections and knowledge. We hear very clearly, but people imagine that they know about the nature of things when they don't know about them, right? There's this very clear argument of like, you think you know stuff, but you really don't. Right? People often have an over-exaggerated view of your own understanding of the way that the universe is and how things work. You likely have a little bit of knowledge in some areas. You're like, yeah, I kind of know that, but again, you're not really an expert at it, and you have an over-exaggerated view of your own understanding. You've got a grasp on it, but you don't have that firm hold. And this is true for all of us. Have you ever spouted off something, right, in your own life that you just knew a little bit about and kind of were trying to present yourself as being a little bit more sure about it? And usually when there's an actual expert there, you end up getting humbled pretty quickly, right? They kind of look at you and go, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. You're off, right? And so your reaction and response to that becomes its own sort of larger debate. And so continuing here, not having come to an understanding at first because they think that they know, they end, as might be expected, in contradicting one another and themselves. This is the problem when we try to act like we know what we're talking about and don't. We end up kind of arguing against ourselves. We're not advancing ideas in the way that we really think we have. For Socrates, we see that the beginning of our discussion of what the passions do is rooted in ignorance. Here the notion of the passions are these impulses in you that oftentimes could lead to good or bad depending on who you are, and we'll probably touch on those ideas throughout the semester as well. Very similar to the ideas of ignorance causing problems we find within the Buddhist understanding as well. Right, that we have the cause of pain and suffering is in ignorance. And here Socrates is kind of saying the same thing, right? That we have our own ignorance will kind of puff us up, and then we'll end up kind of screwing up as a result of that, and then we'll have pain and suffering as a result of that. We see within this too that Socrates has two guiding and ruling principles. Let us note that in every one of us, he says, there are two guiding and ruling principles, which lead us whether they will. One is the natural desire of pleasure. Right? We all want pleasurable things. This is why we call it pleasurable, because we desire it in one way, right? He says the other is an acquired opinion, which aspires after the best. Right? So we want pleasure, and then we have opinions as what might give us pleasure. Right? So they're not always one and the same, right? Sometimes, by the way, this notion of pleasure might be translated as excellence. We have this sort of idea here. And these two are sometimes in harmony, and sometimes, then again, at war, he points out. Sometimes the one and sometimes the other concurs, right? Conquers. We have this sort of idea of we want pleasure. We're thinking, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go here. I'm going to go spend some time with these people because it's going to be a good time. And you go, and sometimes you're right, and sometimes you're wrong. You're like, wow, that person, I thought they were a great guy. They're a jerk. I hate them. Or, hey, they're fantastic. Lifelong friends. Everything's going well. Right? We have this sort of possibility, right? We want this pleasure, however we're going to see it, and sometimes we'll think that this is a good idea and it'll produce it. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes when we're seeking after something excellent, it is, and sometimes it's not. He says that when opinion, by the help of reason, leads us to the best, the conquering principle is called temperance. So if the opinion actually leads to the best, he's going to say that this is a temperate idea. But when desire, which is devoid of reason, rules in us and drags us to pleasure, the power of misrule is called excess. Right? So if we're only thinking what's best is because we desire something so strongly, and there's no reason behind that, it's just an animalistic impulse, right? This is now excessive, and this is going to sway us in the wrong direction. This is the sort of tension that Socrates kind of places within the nature of all of us, right? That we want excellence, and if we are using our reason to produce something, then this is the temperate, this is the good way of living, right? That we want a sort of temperate way of approaching stuff. If on the other hand, we're just going after our desires because we think this is going to be the best, and it's kind of that gut control, that animalistic impulse, then that's excessive, and that's going to usually lead you not to what is the best, is what also Socrates is arguing there. Now, the other work we have from Descartes that we're discussing is his discussion on the passions of the soul. Here, the term passions are not really a common term that we use much anymore, except for in very small sort of circles. But the passions are those impulses in us that lead us one way or the other. Those are the things that are natural to all of us, but sometimes kind of control us instead of us controlling them. For Catholics, usually the passions are identified easiest as the 7 deadly sins, although again each of these has within their beginning something that can do well or harm you depending on how everything goes. So his discussion here on the passions is very much in line with just kind of religious understanding, but he's trying to figure out how this works within our own mind and how we can move and perceive and understand our own impulses and control our own lives. And again, others will continue to have this discussion. We'll end up having Hume discuss it as well, and we can go back and look at other works that Aquinas did on the idea of the passions of the soul as well, and we can go on to many others who will use this term and discuss it. Even William James is a fairly early example of also discussing this. But here he says, the passions that are aroused in us by the objects that stimulate the sense aren't different for every difference among the objects, but only corresponding to differences in how the objects can harm or benefit us, or more generally have importance for us. What's really interesting with Descartes is that his treatment of the passions doesn't begin with the objective impulses themselves, but begins with the subjective, with the individual. Right? What is going to arouse your interest is going to be different than what will arouse mine. You have different impulses, desires. You have different things that you like than I like. You might hear something and it might get you really, really excited, and I might hear the same thing and go, whatever. And you're just going to be like, come on, it's so great. And I'm going to be like, maybe. Right? There's different philosophers or arguments that I hear for the nature of this course and within that discussion that I really like, that you might go, nah, I don't like that one as much, but this other one over here that you didn't quite seem to as engaged in, that's really excited me. And again, all of us are different, and so Descartes kind of begins from the subjective, which is fantastic, right? What's going to engage you or arouse you or enrage you will be different than it will be for the other people around us. Each of us has different challenges, different interests, so we have different ways we're going to react to the same thing. For Descartes, it is how we see the objects around us. It is about our perception. This is very similar to Socrates and Augustine and Aristotle and Aquinas as well, right? That these other sorts of things exist around us. But really what we're seeing Descartes' argument being built off of is the argument from St. Bonaventure, right, in his work, The Journey of the Mind to God. Right, that sensation is not simply the reception of sensible likeness of material objects to the soul. It is the act whereby the soul, affected by the sense objects, judges it, to definitely use the language of Bonaventure. And Descartes, too, when he's talking about soul here, we're talking about the totality of who you are, as opposed to just your rational intellect, which might be mind and soul, again, become those very confusing and overlapping terms, as again Plato is even talking about the soul, when we might think more of that as the mind, but this connection to those objects around us. Right? following Bonaventure and Descartes here, right? We judge these objects, these sensations, by the relation of the object to the source of knowledge, that is ultimately with God. For Descartes, our sensations and our judgments of them dictate our passions. What passions do for us is they consist in our will and disposing our soul to those things. And then it decides if it's useful for us, and therefore we persist in it, or it agitates, he says, the agitation of the spirits that normally cause the passions also dispose the body to move in ways that help to bring about those useful things. Right? This becomes the sort of treatment. And again, this is very much following the lines of Bonaventure. But he's, again, starting with the subjective, while Bonaventure kind of addressed this broadly as a universalizing thing. Descartes is talking about individual sensations and how those apply to our passional nature. What's essential for understanding Descartes is that apprehension becomes key to how we will react or judge something. For example, if I was to tell you that tomorrow is going to be the best day of your life, it's probably one of the worst things I could do to you. But if I was able to tell you and was able to convince you that I had, through some sort of, divine revelation or time travel or who knows what, that tomorrow is going to be the best day of your life, and I told you that today, you're going to spend all of tomorrow wondering, is this the good part? Is this the best part? Is this the most exciting part of my day? Is this what he was talking about? And everything is, you're going to judge it, and you're going to go, this can't be it, because it's not perfect. It's not extraordinary. It might actually have been the best day of your life, but at the end of the day, you're going to walk and say, that day kind of sucked. I felt miserable. It was a bad day. Why? Because you thought it was going to be so much more exceptional than it was. Objectively speaking, it might have been a fantastic day, and it might have actually been the best day of your life. But when your apprehension is that it's going to be phenomenal, regular or even good doesn't hold up to that standard. Similarly, apprehension could go the other way. If I told you I was going to find you and hit you in the hand with a hammer, you're going to worry about that and be anxious, and we might say rightfully so. And your anxiety and your concerns are going to outweigh possibly even the pain of getting hit in the hand with a hammer. And therefore, the pain that you're suffering and enduring is more. Or you might just say, all right, get it over with, and expecting that it's going to hurt. They go, it wasn't that bad. Right? How we are going to see and perceive and approach things are all going to change what they are in us as well. So again, it's not only just we're going to start from a subjective, but also where you are before that subjective. What sort of apprehension you have about the events and what is known to you. Descartes, in classical Descartes fashion, also gives us an orderly list of the passions, and he's going through, wonder in 53, esteem and contempt in 54, and veneration and scorn in 55. And as you went through and you read these and you saw all of these, you're going to notice that almost every single one of them was a sort of binary, right? There becomes this sort of one end of the spectrum and the other, right? Vainglory and shame, love and hate, veneration and scorn, joy and sadness. Even the ones that are left by themselves, wonder, desire, and remorse, all kind of have this binary character built into them. Right? You may wonder, and it may end up being a good wonder, or your wonder might be a bad wonder, and that can be moved and looked and perceived differently. So it's very interesting to start off with that the passions are this sort of binary that has the same root in the same thing as it moves through and moves forward. for Descartes and his conceptions of it. They're all beginning at your middle spot, and then again will either bring you to joy or to sadness, but they have that same root in sensibility, for instance. Descartes advances this by talking about the powers of the soul. Primarily, he begins that the soul has two powers. The power to desire something, right? That where you're going to approach something and you're going to want it. And the power to be annoyed. And some of you are like, that's the one I got, right? But this annoyance, right? In other words, we have the power to want it or not want it, to kind of put it in a more broader way, right? He's going to say from this, the soul also has the powers of wonder, hope, love, and anxiety, and thus the power to receive into itself every other passion and to perform the actions to which the passions impel it. So I don't see, Descartes says, why they have chosen to relate them all to desire or anger, right? That this all are some of these other sorts of schools of thoughts on the passions. He's going to say everything can kind of come in here, that it's not just desire and annoyance, but anger and frustration or anything else like that. Everything else can kind of grow out of this. Furthermore, he says it is easy to see that the passions are useful only because they strengthen and prolong thoughts that are good for the soul to have, and which otherwise might be easily wiped out. So the passions have this sort of great strength to them, that they can advance in you something that's good and beneficial. Although, Descartes does point out, when they do harm, because sometimes they do, and traditionally that's usually what people are speaking about the passions was the harm they do. He says that is only because they strengthen and preserve these thoughts beyond what is required, or strengthen and preserve thoughts that it isn't good to give any time to. Right? So this becomes part of that whole issue within the passions as well, that you might be focusing in on and meditating on and just scrutinizing things that are really not that helpful and really should kind of move along and not be important for you. This is really where Descartes wants to somewhat separate notions of passion and your passional nature from obsession, where it brings these ideas beyond what it should be. Right? The passions for Descartes are all the same. Both can be used for good or ill. It's not just about knowledge or ignorance, like we might see others and their treatments of the passions, like Socrates would make this argument, and the Buddha would make another one like this. But it is about our reception of this stimulus that makes it good or evil, following notions of Bonaventure. But the act will be taken differently by different people, and therefore the effects of the passions differ. This is also part of the reason why they're paired. Esteem and contempt, hope and despair. Are they going to help build something up and strengthen something good inside of you as they prolong and linger? Or is it going to move to chaos and ugliness and become notions of obsession? So this becomes part of the fear and the pushback that Descartes wants to discuss within the passions. That we have different ways and different avenues how we might want to see and treat and move within them. That again, it starts from the subjective, but what you're going to do if you take it too far, the same stimulus could become bad and something that's harmful. We spoke a little bit about Descartes and his notion of the passions, and so we'll conclude by addressing Hume and his dissertation on the passions as well. He says the present theory of the passions, for him, the present theory of Descartes, depends entirely on the double relations of sentiments and ideas, and the mutual assistance of these in relation to provide for each other, as we discussed before. The virtues, talents, accomplishments, and possessions of others make us love and esteem them. That is because these objects arouse a pleasing sensation related to love and also have a relation or connection with the person. Just like Descartes, the virtues or the good passions are grounded in our relation of the person to the object. And again, this is really best understood through Bonaventure in that discussion, which we'll address later, of the journey of the mind into God. But when we order the passions is reversed, the same effect, Hume points out, does not follow, that we may pass easily from love and affection to pride and vanity. And so let's take a quick pause from Hume to understand Hume here. So I want you to quickly state in your mind the opposites of the things that I'm going to mention. The opposite of white is black. The opposite of up is down. Good. The opposite of dog is, oh, I know what y'all said, a cat. Why is it that the opposite of white is black, up is down, and dog is cat? Why is the opposite of dog not snake? The opposite of up not blue? Why is it not right or left? East, west? Why does it have to be down? This is a really interesting sort of idea that will relate back to Hume, so indulge me for a moment, right? Each of these have a category, a color, a direction, or something, right? The domestic animal, each of these share nearly every quality except for one essential difference. This is why we call an opposite. For this reason, that other divisions and cultural distinctions will be made manifest, right? If we're in a different culture, we might have a different answer to what the opposite of a dog is. But for the broad American culture, the opposite of a dog is a cat. Because these are the two most common pets, and we think of these, and we usually even think of them as kind of antagonistic or something else, right? You're either a dog person or a cat person, even though many people have both. But you're one or the other, and that's going to tell me a certain something about you if you're one or the other. Right? And it's through the dialogue that we're going to face these sorts of divisions and understand things, right? That opposites are similar in nearly every way, except for one, and that this is going to shape and perceive our understanding of that. That the opposite is the opposite because it differs on the same sort of relation. Opposites are the most similar. That's why they are the most opposite, which is odd, but this is kind of the way that they are. For a while, I lived in Iowa. And Iowa, for those of you who don't know, is the #1 corn and pork producing state in the nation. Or at least most years it is. Depends on, maybe something will change. And Iowans loved to kind of poke at Nebraskans, who are often the #2 in those productions. The states are both rather similar. One large city, one major college town, lots of farmland, both Midwest towns, both similar sorts of groups of people, and both are very fine. And but yet Iowans love to dig at Nebraskans. And I've known many a fine Nebraskan as well. But you end up getting this sort of like, why? Why is it I'm going to make fun of you? Why is it I'm going to tease you? Because I'm so similar to you. Because we share this sort of relation. Now, if you actually get out of, say, Des Moines and you go into the south of Iowa, you get a little bit of like, oh, we're looking down at Missourians. But that's, again, because of you're that close. And really, they're not thinking of all of Missouri. They're thinking of northern Missouri, right where they're at. Right? The opposites, those who you are most antagonistic to, are similar in every way but one. And this is even how the passions are to be understood for Hume. Right? Hume says this explains why objects appear large or small only by comparison with those of the same species. A mountain doesn't magnify or diminish a horse in our eyes, but when a Flemish and Welsh horse are seen together, one appears larger and the other smaller than viewed on its own. For those of you unfamiliar, this is not a picture of a Welsh and Flemish horse that you're seeing. It's a Clydesdale and a pony. But again, the idea of scope is always here in relation, which does go back to Hume's ideas at the very beginning as well. That the way that we understand things is always in relation with one to another, right? That the mind is, we have this idea of everything being in shape and relation to one and another, that this is the faculty of reflection, right? That this becomes part of all of this is the way that this is done before it becomes copied by our mind, right? That we have this idea of how big it is and shape always in relation to one another, and that this is how it should be. This is why if I was to simply show you one of these horses, you wouldn't know if it's particularly big or small, but when they're next to each other, then they are indeed very obviously something that is different. And so that is an important distinction to make with Hume. This plays within even our own understandings on how we see ourselves and these passions, as were discussed by Descartes. He's going to tell us that things like envy arises from the superiority in others, but what arouses it is not the great disproportion between ourselves and the others, but on the contrary, our proximity. That we are going to envy and hate not people who are better than us, but people who are most like us. That when we cannot break this association, we feel a stronger desire to remove the superiority, or the one who is superior. This seems to be the reason why travelers, he says, though commonly lavish their praise on the Chinese and Persians, take care to depreciate nations that are near to their native country and may be rivals to it. This is why Iowans might kind of jokingly kind of insult, play with, etc. Nebraskans. I'm sure Nebraskans do it with their own host of people, possibly even Iowans as well. But I didn't live in Nebraska, I lived in Des Moines. And so we have different sorts of ideas and relations within all of that. That we have this notion of comparison, and the closer you are is when you are going to end up having your passions excited, your minds and your perceptions, because they are bigger or more grandiose than you. If you were to be a concert pianist, I would say, wow, that's fantastic. I would have no envy in you because I'm not. I'm not an amateur. I'm not a quasi, I'm not second chair and you're first or whatever, and this sort of thing. I would just admire you for your talent. I'd probably not even fully understand how talented you are because of my non-familiarity with that. But if you were to, sit here and start challenging me and say, I dislike you on X, Y, and Z, and your understanding of Hume is blah, 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 and we're arguing about that. And you might make a good point. I might go, I now dislike you because you made this good point, and therefore anger, envy, jealousy, etc. might arise. So that's kind of what he's trying to talk about. Where you're most similar is where you're going to have the greatest amount of conflict. And for Hume, this is an important understanding for our notions of the passions, just like it was important notions of apprehension were for Descartes. For Hume, it's proximity. Now, there is some extreme downsides to addressing our worldview following Hume. He states that we know no real connection between one thing and another. We only know that the idea of one thing is associated with the idea of another, and that the imagination easily passes between them. What does this mean? Well, famously, Hume rejects the idea of cause and effect. This plays out with his treatments of proofs for the existence of God, but also when addressing the passions, and really in almost every aspect of his philosophy. Even those things that are internal, he refuses to see these connections. He argues famously that it's just as rational to believe that the sun will not rise tomorrow as to say that it will, because the only reason why you think that it would is off of a faulty notion that there is cause and effect, that the universe has to continue going on the way that it has by your perceptions, that there's some sort of governing rule that exists outside of this. And we have to give Hume a little bit of credit, which pains me to say because I'm not a big fan of Hume's, in that we oftentimes relate notions of correlation with notions of causation, and correlation is not causation. For instance, we see this nice little map and graph that the total revenue generated by arcades correlates very nicely with computer science doctorate degrees awarded in the United States between the year 2000 and 2009. Now, this correlation shouldn't imply a causation. There might be some overlapping reason, people are more involved in maybe arcades, computer games, graphics, and technology, and maybe therefore there's a greater interest in computer science and advanced degrees in that, but doctorates take a long time to earn, and there generally would be a lag in these interests, and it also just seems like they're two numbers that kind of go along with each other, and you might try to draw a connection, but you're going to have to work on it, and it's not an obvious one, and it's not one that would really be worth spending your time on. To show this, we can look at worldwide non-commercial space launches, which happens to also correlate with sociology doctorates awarded in the United States within roughly that same period of time. Again, we've moved industries, but we're also seeing non-commercial space launches. That has nothing to do with sociology. That is, no sort of connections can be made, and yet we see a correlation. Right? That just because there's a connection doesn't mean that one is caused by the others. And we have to kind of realize that there is a break in our mind and give Hume some credit in saying, don't run to notions of causation all the time. Again, no sort of connections with the divorce rate in Maine and the per capita consumption of margarine. None of you would say, please do butter instead of margarine. Don't you care about the sanctity of marriage in Maine? We would find this idea ludicrous. Or crude oil imports from Norway happens to correlate with drivers killed in collision with railroad trains. You're not going to say we need to cut off our imports from Norwegian oil to save rail traffic deaths. Or the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool happens to also correlate very closely with the films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. While we might want to blame the Oscar winner for people deciding I'm going to just throw myself into the pool and die, I think that's, not really the most appropriate thing to do. And Nicholas Coppola doesn't deserve that much derision, even though some of his movies are a little odd, to say the least. But right, we're not able to draw these connections, and while there might be correlations, they really shouldn't be seen as causations. But there are still causes and effects. Hume goes too far when he just disregards the whole idea. There are rational claims that we can and should make about the nature of reality and what causes other things to come into being, even within ourselves. We do have things that we know in our own lives that cause us to go too far. You can look at your own life and realize that you have inclinations which, taken to an extreme, are not healthy for you. And that one little step down that road means you're already lost. Or two steps, or if you spend time with that person, you often get yourself into trouble. There are a lot of things that are a result of a chain of causes, or we may want to blame the last action, but there are many on and off ramps along the way where you could jump off and have avoided this. You should, again, have some introspection and look at your own lives and see what are the causes for your actions going too far. And we have to disregard Hume because while correlation is not always causation, there are things that exist outside of our mind, and we also know that we have particular actions which lead us to go too far. So you need to stop and reflect a little bit more about how you see the passions in your own life. What are the passions that you struggle with? What are the ones that aid you, possibly? How is it that you'd like to define them? Are they good, like Hegel said, or bad, like the 7 deadly sins or the 3 poisons? Are they what happen if your inclinations are taken too far? Or is it just big things? Remember, your first paper is coming up where you're going to be expected to lay this out and spell it out. Now, there's not a right or wrong answer that's expected of you, but it's important for you to at least put something down and stop and reflect and write it and have it be concrete that you could come back to and adjust when need be going forward. And maybe say, you know what, my definition has changed after encountering Stoicism or asceticism through medieval Catholic practices. Maybe that'll adjust how you're going to look at things going forward. Maybe not. But you need to stop and think and reflect about this and come up with your answer at that point.